Hey guys, how's it going? Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep,
Yep.
Okay, perfect.
that sounds good.
Awesome. We'll wait just another second or two. We'll get started. Florence keeps getting sick at her preschool, and so this is like cold number 4 in the past 6 weeks.
Oh
That
no, that
Oh
is a lot of
no.
colds.
uh
Oh,
it's like I don't know. I guess it's just how 2-year-olds are. I don't know, but everyone then in the house like catches it from her, and it's like, ugh. Hopefully, this will mean that she won't catch so much as the year goes on. But
That's it, building that strong foundational immunity.
right, hopefully, guess I'll try to look at it that way. All right, why don't I get started? So, as usual, I like to share my screen so there's something to look at here. So I asked you guys to return, well, actually, no, this one was new for us, this lens materials and or lens, oh no, actually, I think we may have touched on this a little bit sooner, but the multifocal part of it should have been newish material. So as we go down a little bit farther, and then, oh, actually, no, I didn't ask you to read down. Sorry, guys, I'm all confused here, but I didn't actually ask you to read this one on multifocals. I think it was the other PDF that I had asked you to do. I'm just gonna quickly um, open that real quick. And meeting 6. Okay, so this was kind of the one that touched on the types of lenses, like the multifocals and stuff. So we'll kind of hit upon this in a little bit. And then I wanted to also review the lens materials and coatings one that we had looked at a little bit back. So, oops, let me just quickly pull that up. Oh, why do I keep doing that? I can't see. I think I have to just find where that one was. Okay, yeah, so that was back here. Okay. And then I had a few videos for you guys. So in some ways, these next couple classes are a little bit more kind of the regular opticianry or what we think of as opticianry classes, kind of the more practical skills. So, um, I kind of like both. I think they're both kind of fun. But this is probably more if you were kind of like, all right, I'm going to take the ABO test. These are, I'm assuming, maybe more what you thought it might be like. So, um, anyway, let me look at my notes first. So I actually think I might just put up a whiteboard real quick so that I can show you a couple things. So let me do that. Okay. So from here, we went back to, thank you, to the lens coatings and materials PDF that I had just showed you, but that I had asked you guys to read a few weeks ago, I think, 3 or so classes ago. But I wanted to go back over it because when we went over that, it was relatively quick. It wasn't, something that we really got into in depth. So I figured that I'll kind of hit on some of the points from that chapter just because it really is such a critical, part of opticianry that I just want to make sure that all of those things are well fleshed out. So, one of the images that I wanted to put up, and this is actually from, just gonna snip it real quick. This one is from the video that you guys um, hopefully watched concerning how anti-reflective coatings are made. I'm a big fan of that video. I just think it's like really helpful for when you're talking to patients about anti-reflective coatings. It's really nice to kind of understand what that, sometimes it's called the AR stack, kind of like what all of that is and how it's tested, and kind of the goals that labs have and that manufacturers have for anti-reflective coating. So the reason I'm kind of putting up this picture is because this is just a little still from the video, and it shows the oleophobic, I'm sorry, the hydrophobic layer of the anti-reflective coating. So you can kind of make out a little drop of water that is on the lens on the AR coating here. And if you remember from the video, he kind of tilts this lens a little bit and the water runs off of it. And that's one of the tests that they do at a lab to kind of ensure the quality, the hydrophobic properties of anti-reflective coating. Okay, so um, you know, that that's definitely an important part of it. And then I'm gonna put up one more little picture here, because this is arguably another really important element of anti-reflective coating, and that is the oleophobic layer. Okay. So basically, in this case, they are talking about kind of the smudge proofness of the lens. And I think that it's important to kind of understand here. I used to think that something, the kind of the oleophobic layer of an anti-reflective coating just made it easier to clean off. So it does do that. It makes it easier to clean than, say, an uncoated lens. But it really actually makes it so you're a lot less likely to actually get the lens smudged in the first place. So that's also something that's really nice to kind of educate patients on, is that, yeah, like, it's really hard, not to touch the surface of a coated lens or any kind of lens, and get fingerprints on it. But the coating that's oleophobic, or, a coating that is oleophobic or has an oleophobic layer, will actually make it both easier to clean and less likely to actually get those smudges in the first place. So, other thing that the video talked a little bit about was, and the readings talked a little bit about, was an anti-static layer. And so that is one of the most important parts of the anti-reflective coatings as well, because it tries to repel dust, right? So it tries to make it less likely that dust would actually get onto the surface of the lens. And I don't know if you guys have encountered this particular thing yet, but when you're working with patients in optical, sometimes you'll have people come in and they'll give you their lenses or their glasses, and you'll see like circular scratches, like completely like just ground into the surface of the lens or the surface of the anti-reflective coating layer. And you might look at it and be like, wait, how did there get to be like circles in this? But what it is that there is dust on lenses. And so they're basically, when they're cleaning them with a cleaning cloth, they're using the cleaning cloth, which is great, but there's either, most likely there's dust on the lens. They're not rinsing them first under the faucet or, with soap and water. They're just kind of going for it, with that cloth, and they're actually grinding dust into the lens and creating more scratches than ever would have probably been there had they just not cleaned them so much. So, definitely having a dust repellent layer or an anti-static layer makes that less likely to happen. But if you are ever, talking to patients about cleaning their glasses, it's really a good idea to advise them to clean them, unless they're kind of of a wooden material or a material that can't go in water, it's really best just to tell them to use like a lukewarm water. You don't want hot water. You don't want to kind of crack that anti-reflective coating, but a lukewarm water with a mild detergent. So something like that you would wash the dishes with. Nothing like Windex. Having a cleaner with alcohol, like denatured alcohol, is also kind of controversial. Some people swear by it, but many people say that that does crack the lens material, or that it makes the anti-reflective coating peel. So the best thing to advise people is to run it under the faucet with lukewarm water, and then to just use like a mild dish detergent like Dawn or Dove, some kind of soap to clean it with. They can also use the spray cleaner. The spray cleaner is nice too. I would imagine that less dust kind of comes off of that, just because there's less water or less liquid that you're putting on the lens. But that's another nice thing to use too. And then they want to clean those cleaning cloths, right? Some people don't know that you can just toss those in the washing machine, right? And so if you never clean your cleaning cloth, it's also likely to be pretty dirty and have little specks of dust on it too. So just some good tips to talk to people about when they're in the office. So important to know the layers of the AR. The other thing that I felt like I didn't quite go over to the fullest extent was how anti-reflective coatings work. So I'm going to put another image up here. It's an image from that same reading real quick. And it just talks a little bit about, as they title it, the science behind anti-reflective coatings. Okay, so this picture, I think, will help you remember kind of the big keys to the science behind anti-reflective coating. But basically, what you want to think about here is that when the reflective or the reflections, I should say, are in phase, that means that they look like waves like this. Okay, so they're kind of going together, right? Um, and what the anti-reflective coating does essentially is it pushes them out of phase. So you can see here that there's an extra ray of light, of reflection, that's created from this anti-reflective coating, and you can see that it is kind of causing all of the waves to be not in phase, right? It's causing interference, so they're out of phase. So what that does is it actually just allows the light to pass through the lens better, and it makes it less reflective. So definitely something to kind of review, to understand the basics of. I wouldn't say that you really need to know like tons of ins and outs about this, but definitely helpful to kind of understand the concept of what waves look like when they're in phase, and then kind of what interference does. It makes them out of phase, and it allows the light to go through the lens rather than bounce off of it. So other important concept. The last thing is, I would take a look, like if you guys are in the office and you take a look at say a demo lens, or maybe you have a patient who elected to not get anti-reflective coating and you're adjusting their glasses, definitely take a look at how cleanable an uncoated lens is versus a coated lens. Okay. I used to think kind of, when I was early in my optical days, that it didn't really make that much of a difference to have anti-reflective coating in terms of even just cleaning the lens, but having worked a lot more with lenses at this point, and edging a lens that's uncoated versus coated lenses, and then having to clean them and, get them ready to ship out to the patient. I will tell you, like 1,000%, it is so much harder to clean and remove markings and get an uncoated lens ready to be super clean and pristine looking and just have absolutely no smudges than it is to clean up an anti-reflective coated lens. So I would recommend that, when you have a chance to look at an uncoated lens, I would go ahead and do that. All right, so to move on a little bit more, they also I showed you guys or gave you a video of how polarization worked, and I'm gonna put up a little snip of that video. It had kind of this funny guy. Um, I can imagine the little snippet from the news station that this was, but I thought it was a pretty nice, like, simple explanation of polarization, and it had some good visuals. So, at any rate, with polarized lenses, right? So when we're talking polarized lenses, we're generally thinking of sunglass lenses. Now, you can also have polarized colors. So I've seen probably the most common one besides like polarized gray, polarized brown, or polarized G15. Just a reminder, G15 is kind of a combination of green and gray. But the fourth color I guess I would say that's most common in polarized lenses is a yellow. So you may have seen that, but they can do all sorts of polarized colors like purple or pink or what blue, whatever you want. But basically, what polarization is for is to really cut glare. But how it does that is the picket fence analogy, which is what this guy is showing here, is really helpful to think about it. So it basically only lets the vertically polarized light waves go through it. Okay. So it's cutting out the horizontal waves. And what that does, is it basically just cuts essentially, 50% or about half of the glare that's in the environment. Okay. And when you think about polarization versus anti-reflective coating, sometimes people can get a little confused about, well, it's both glare, right? It's both kind of reflections. That's true. The thing to think about with polarized lenses is that it's really working on glare that is environmental. So what that means is you're going to use these for someone who loves fishing and wants to kind of see into the surface of the water, right? You're going to talk about polarized lenses when someone is driving and is kind of reacting to the rain and the glare that kind of comes up from, the reflections that come off of the water, or if they're talking about driving on a wet road when it's sunny and they really see that glare kind of being reflected off the surface of the road. That's what polarization is typically for. You could think about it like almost looking like a Photoshop filter. Whereas anti-reflective coating, that's also going to work on glare, but it's primarily working on glare that's related to the eyeglass lenses themselves. Okay, so it's not really environmental glare. Like I would say a little bit, like anti-glare coating helps with night driving for sure. So in that sense, it kind of gets into like an environmental situation, but it's really mostly working on reducing the glare that's in the lenses, okay, or that comes from having lenses in front of your eyes. So that's really an important key there, because sometimes you'll hear of people kind of recommending anti-glare coating in a pair of glasses for people with night driving, and that makes a ton of sense if the person wears glasses or needs correction as well. If they don't really need correction, it doesn't make sense to put a pair of lenses that are going to reflect more light in front of them. So in that case, maybe a polarized lens would make a lot more sense, if they don't have any correction. So that's kind of an important concept, the environmental glare versus the lens glare. So I also wanted to show you a couple images of how polarization is done, and I think it's actually illustrated really well by kind of how it gets messed up, oddly enough. So I'm going to just put another couple of snips here. Um, but polarization is done with a laminate layer, and it's actually done with polyvinyl. So let me just put a picture here up. Um, but I figured you could see this. It's a tad bit blurry here, but let me scroll up. I figured you could see this actually really well um, by the fact that this is actually delaminating. So sometimes you'll see like a lens come in, and this is, a picture that someone took of their polarized lenses, and you might come in, if someone brought this in, you might be like, oh, wow, like the anti-glare is patching and peeling and it's just kind of like separating from the surface of the lens. But I have a second picture that kind of illustrates that that's not really what's going on. So let me get that one into the whiteboard as well. The same pair of glasses, but just kind of, I think it's the other side of them. And you can see in this one that it's just like, you can see like something crazy is going on. Like it looks like a spider web, it looks like crystals. And what's happening is that polyvinyl layer, that layer of polarized film, is actually separating from the surface of the lens material. And one way to kind of remember that polarization is actually a polyvinyl layer is that sometimes, like, how like patients will sometimes get polarized lenses and they'll come back and they'll be like, oh, it's just not dark enough. Like, I just want it more dark. Um, One thing that sometimes labs will offer to do, and some labs do it, some labs don't, so it's not necessarily something that you should go ahead and offer people without knowing 100% if the lab will do it. But some labs will actually tint over polarization. And so what that means is they'll get a polarized lens, the film is inside it, and then they'll put that into a tint tank and make it like, a little bit darker basically. But a lot of labs will say, no, we don't do that because the heat of the tint delaminates the polarized layer. So that's a little trick to kind of just remember how polarization is done, is think about tinting it and what labs say that tinting it does. So I don't know why some labs are okay with doing it and some labs aren't, but we've worked with labs that said both. So last thing that's kind of memorable and interesting and will help you on in your work with patients is that, again, I have a photo. Um, when polarized lenses, and you guys may have seen this already, are put in front of a computer screen, they look like this. Um, and this is normal. They basically are showing a lot of, sometimes you'll see these posted like online, like on like an optician group or something. And people tend to like freak out about it. They're like, oh my gosh, like why does it look like this? I've had patients kind of bring this up and be like, when I look at them in the computer or when I look at the computer screen, like they look like all messed up. And it is normal. This is something that you can just kind of see where the lens is slightly stressed, you could say. I mean, this doesn't look like major stress. It's just kind of those are the pressure points of where the lens is touching the eye wire a little bit more in those places. And so, just because it's in front of a screen, with some level of polarization of its own, meaning the computer monitor, you can see more kind of the polarization in the eyeglass lenses. So it's definitely something that can't be fully eliminated. You can also, some I don't know if this is something that would actually be on the test, but there are polariscopes that do test for stress. And so you can actually kind of simulate this situation, not using a computer screen, but with a polariscope to see if there's undue stress on the lenses or significant warping of the lenses because they've been edged too large and have basically been stuffed into a frame. So again, this is not really one of those cases. Um, some people will be like, well, if you don't want your glasses to have this appearance in front of the computer screen when they're polarized, then don't look at them in front of a computer screen. So it's kind of just the way of things with polarization. But you may have noticed this, like if you have a pair of polarized lenses and you're like behind a windshield, sometimes it'll have a somewhat similar effect like this too, because of polarization that seems to be in parts of windshields too. So anyway, let's move on a little bit. I also wanted to just briefly recap about photochromic lenses. So photochromic lenses is what we think of now as transitions. So lenses basically that darken when UV rays hit them. Old photochromic technology was not as good, and oftentimes you'll hear patients kind of refer back to that. It could take as much as an hour when the technology first came out to get fully clear after returning inside. So you could imagine that that would definitely like not be something that some people would really enjoy. But that definitely has been changed quite a bit. They do darken more in cold weather. So if you've ever had a pair of transitions lenses or photochromic lenses, you'll notice that they do kind of turn more quickly when it's wintertime. And they also, which is another really interesting fact, they also kind of have a lifetime. So, it's not something that you have patients mention frequently. Like I actually maybe have had just, one or two people ever mention this to me, but basically there's kind of a certain number of times that the lenses will really darken super fully. I mean, it's thousands of times. It's not something that, the regular patient is going to bump into anytime soon, like right after they get their glasses. But they do start to, over time, be a little bit less effective. So, it's definitely over years, you might remember that they got pretty darn dark at first, and over the years they get a little bit less dark when they turn. They do still turn, but maybe they protect you from the sun a little bit less in terms of the darkness. So, other couple things about photochromic lenses. Silver halide is the component that makes the lenses change. That was definitely a question that I had on my test. I don't know if it's on all of the tests, but the active ingredient or the ingredient that actually does the changing is silver halide, and definitely a good one to know. And then two other things about photochromic lenses. So imbibing is the term that describes how the photochromic dye is put into the lens. Nowadays, it is just kind of put into the lens in a very even layer, just under the surface of the lens. However, when photochromic lenses first came out, they would actually dye the entire lens throughout it. And that wasn't as good because in thicker areas of the lens, so say you had a higher minus lens and your lenses were thicker on the temporal side on the outside, that would mean that the transitions would actually be darker on the outside than they would on the inside. And oftentimes that would be the reverse for someone with a plus prescription. So not ideal. So nowadays, when they imbibe the lenses with dye, they're just doing it on like the surface or a layer close to the surface rather than throughout the entire thickness of the material. Alrighty, just another couple things that I wanted to just recap on from that particular reading, but I did also suggest watching a video about tinting. With John Seegers, who is the Laramie K optician guy. He has tons, like hundreds of really, really helpful, informative videos. Super, super awesome stuff that he makes, I think, still on a weekly basis. And he's been doing it, for years and years. So anyway, the video, hopefully you watched it, had a good amount, it was fairly long, but it had a lot of information about how tinting is done. And I like for people to see that because it's a fairly low tech, kind of classic opticianry skill. And, a lot of people at this point do not do it on their own. Typically, people are going to send tints to the lab. But before, people did this stuff more in-house, and you'd go to your local optician's shop and they'd have a tint tank in the back, and they would, if you ordered sunglasses, it was less likely that you were going to get polarized ones, and they would go ahead and tint them instead. Some colored tints were definitely more popular even just 10 years ago. When I was kind of beginning this, I remember that there would be some patients that would come in and they would always ask for like a rose tint or like a bi-gradient tint. He talks about that a little bit in one of the videos. Kind of the thought was that it kind of made you look a little bit less pale under your eyes if you had kind of a rose tint at the bottom. So that was definitely something that was a bit more common, even just like I said, about 10 years ago. Couple things to know about tinting. So, quick recap. So polycarbonate lenses are fairly untintable, right? When we tint poly, which is something that can be done now, we're actually tinting the hard coat that's on poly. We're not actually tinting the lens material itself. So you can order tinted poly, but depending on kind of the makeup of that hard coat, meaning the coat that's applied to the surface of the lens, to the surface of the poly, it's really that's changing color and not so much the lens itself. Plastic or CR39, which we don't really use a lot just because it is not shatterproof, does tint quite a bit better. So there are times when someone is unsatisfied with the level of tint that their poly lenses have achieved, usually in like a sun. And basically, when we do a redo, we'll request that it's CR39 because we just know it's going to be darker. Some people love a really dark tint. You've probably had patients that are like as dark as possible. So in those cases, it's probably better to specify CR39. But for most intents and purposes, you don't really need to do that. Like poly is tintable enough and it has the impact resistance and the full or almost full UV protection. So in those cases, it is a better material for what we're trying to achieve. But tinting wise, it can be a little bit harder. Um, when he was doing the video, he talked about using a timer, to kind of make sure that the tints were getting to the darkness level that they needed to be. I know that Cherry, one of the labs that we use somewhat, does a ton of tinting. I know they have, like a staff member that like just does tinting. And it's going to be a couple tint tanks like this. It's going to be surprisingly low tech when you request a tint or a custom tint from Cherry. He talked about neutralizing a tint. So neutralizing is, it's a neutralizer that he had in one of those tanks in that picture. And basically that's used to lighten. So if you go a little darker than you intended, luckily you can put the lens into a neutralizer and just start to lighten it up gradually. He talked about a gradient tint. He has this, you can see it a little bit in this picture, but he had a tint arm that was like a mechanical arm that just kind of dipped the lens again and again. You can't really just hold it in to dye, kind of like an Easter egg, like you'll get a line on it. So you do have to kind of continuously move the lens so that it's not just a hard line on it, so that it is a gradient. And then he talked about double gradient, which basically means that one color is at the top and one color, a different color, is at the bottom. What else? So in the reading, there was a little bit about what the different colors of tints do. One tint that you may have heard about that is probably the most significant or has the most science behind it in terms of it actually functioning, in this way is FL41, which is a therapeutic tint for people primarily with migraines. We used to be able to just kind of easily, he actually did it in the video. He had like a bottle from like BPI of like FL41 tint. And he does one. We used to be able to just order FL41 tints for patients. And for some reason, labs have kind of stopped allowing that or stopped doing that. And typically it's more of a proprietary product that they're using. Like we had, like Cherry was using a company called Axon Lenses for migraine lenses. And so they're not really for some reason as open to just kind of using FL41, which is what had been done for a long time. in the past, basically. But there are a number of migraine brands that you can order from labs. You have to be a little careful, like if you're, kind of a current, someone who's currently working in optical with us, it's not typically something that's easy to get through vision insurance. A little counterintuitive there because you would think, wow, like a therapeutic lens, hey, that sounds perfect for vision insurance. But the vision insurance labs tend to be production based. They have certain products they do, and customized things are not their forte. But certainly FL41 is a good tint for migraines. Um, Yellow, they kind of associate with sports, with hunting, with fog conditions. Pink can help with eye strain. They say that it's good for cycling, for office environments, kind of counteracts some of the fluorescent lights. Blue is recommended for golf. Green is for outdoor sports and apparently can help with rainy conditions. Brown is another one that's recommended for outdoor sports. And then lastly, gray. Gray is known for being close to true colors, so it doesn't really change the colors as much as the other ones do. And then it's the most dark, so for high sun conditions, gray is really good too. So, um, last little bit about tint. This is definitely something that you should know. Um, it's just a good thing to know. I honestly don't know if this would appear on the test. But you should know it. Just a little bit. I know we talked about this briefly in the other class when we talked about this, but it's really good to know your percentages to some extent. You should definitely know that an 80% tint is the norm, right? So, like if you're requesting a sun lens in, say, G15, brown or gray, 80% is what you generally want to do there. If someone wants it really dark, you might be able to go up to like 85 or 90, but you also need to be able to see through the lens, so you can't you can't go too dark. Um, Another really common tint level is between 20 and 30%. So if you were, say, tinting in a color, that's usually kind of where you'd be. But it's really good to kind of understand the different levels. They also mention in the reading, sometimes these are labeled as 1, 2, and 3, especially with polarized lenses, or A, B, and C. And 1, 2, 3, A, B, C, those are identical, but basically the 1 is the lightest level. The 2 or the B is kind of in the middle, so maybe like a 50 or 40%. And then the C or the 3 is going to be kind of an 80% level, whether it's polarized or tinted. So those are super good to know too. All right. The book also talked, I'm sorry, the reading also talked a little bit about Abbey value and specific gravity. And we had touched on that again very briefly, so I just wanted to kind of go back to it. Um, Abbey value is something that you'll hear about quite a bit. Definitely something that's important to have a good handle on. With Abbey value, I always have to remind myself of this, but low Abbey values are bad and high Abbey values are good. Okay. So basically, the more chromatic aberration that a lens can produce or lens material can produce, the lower the Abbey value. So polycarbonate is well known among opticians for having a pretty crummy Abbey value. It's low, it's 32. Um, so a lot of people will be like, I'm not going to use that, but we tend to use it because it's economical, it's shatterproof, and it has UV protection. So, some people will go into Trivex for it. One of the reasons we don't use Trivex as much is just it's also quite soft. Polycarbonate can be soft too, but we typically do anti-reflective coatings, which brings the hardness level back up. But you can see here on this chart kind of the general Abbey values, what kind of excels and what doesn't in terms of Abbey value. But it's not kind of the end all be all. Sometimes occasionally you'll have a patient that complains of seeing kind of rainbows or color distortion. And at that point you might say, okay, let's switch you into maybe like a 160, or like if they don't have a high script, like a CR39 or something, you go into Trivex 2 as an option. But it's not something that you really see a ton of, but it is definitely good to know, lower Abbey values versus higher. And it's good to know just a couple basics about where different lenses fall. Like, it would be good to know that polycarbonate is around a 32, right? That would be a good thing to kind of come into the exam knowing. And it would probably in turn be good to know that CR39 and 160 typically are, considered much better on the Abbey value scale. Specific gravity is basically weight. I would not worry about memorizing these. I don't think it would be worth the time that it would take to do that. I would, however, highly, highly recommend knowing the index of refraction for lens materials. I would know crown glass. I would most certainly know poly. It's really easy to know the high indexes because we talk about them all the time. I would also recommend knowing CR. That those are going to be ones that are very likely to kind of come up on the exam. So definitely, make some flashcards and memorize the index of refraction for those. Okay. So moving on, we had touched on the nominal lens formula a couple times, and I did just really briefly want to kind of come back to that. I found a cool picture that I think illustrates the concept well. The nominal lens formula, just to remind you guys, is where you can use the lens clock and take the front surface measurement of the lens, and then the back curves of the lens as well. Just going to try to make this as large as possible just so that you can see. But basically, I found this picture, which I thought was really interesting because it is the same RX and same lens material in both of these pairs of glasses. And you can see it's not the best picture. So let me just kind of try to highlight it in red. How thick is this line here? I'll make it a little bit thicker. But I'm just going to kind of try to show the thickness on the left eye here. But if I were to draw the thickness of the lens, right, like on this one here, which is actually the older pair, it's, I don't know, about that thick. That's my technical term for that. And then on this one, you can see that it's significantly thicker. Okay. Um, and I feel like this illustrates the concept of that using the lens clock and using the nominal lens formula. I should tell you that I'll just type out what this RX is. I think it's essentially in the right eye um, a minus 475, and then in the left eye I think it's a minus 650. And again, these scripts are the same, right? So what you'll notice here is that this frame over here on our right has a much steeper base curve to it than does this frame on the left, okay? So remember that frames can have base curves. This is something we'll talk a little bit more about as we get more into talking about frames, but frames can have base curves as well as lenses. And so it's really the same concept. It's basically just saying, how curved is the actual front of this entire frame versus how curved is the front of a lens, right? So you can see by this picture that this has a much more dramatic slope on it than does this flat front frame. And so when you have a wrapped sun, when you have a sport frame, say a Wiley X, like an Oakley Sun or something, Acosta, Maui Jim does a lot of these. When you have a super face-formy wrapped frame, you have to choose, or a high base curve frame, we could say, you have to choose lenses, or you should choose lenses with a high base curve as well. Now you're not going to go too crazy, but typically we would want to do at least a 6 base curve on the front. So a 6 curve, a +6 curve on the front, but probably better would be like a +8 curve on the front. And the reason for that is like if we tried to put a super flat lens like in this frame, it would want to kind of bend the shape of the frame out kind of more like this. Um, and it would look kind of funny and it wouldn't fit well. The person edging it would be going crazy because they're trying to like mold the eye wire or the frame to fit this lens that it doesn't really want to fit. So it would be a much better choice to choose a high base curve lens. Okay. Now what does that mean in terms of the lens formula? Just really quickly, hopefully this will illustrate some stuff that we haven't maybe gone over. As thoroughly as we could have. But if you kind of go for this, and when I'm talking about the lens base curve, I'm talking about choosing a lens that kind of maybe has like a 4 base versus having choosing a lens that has more like an 8 base. Okay, so something that's just these are not dramatically different, but significantly different, right? So if you were to use the nominal lens formula to figure this out, the real reason we're talking about this is why is this one thicker than the flat front frame, right? So the deal here is, and I'm just going to kind of type this to hopefully illustrate it. Let's say that we chose a lens. Let's start with this one. Let's say we did a +8 base curve lens because we knew the frame was pretty face formy and wrapped. We would need to go. Let me just type this out, then you guys can see it. Um, we would start with a +8. Okay, so if you used your lens clock on the front of that lens, you'd get a +8. And then we would have to figure out, oops, sorry, let me delete that and get back into, oh, good. Let me just type this real quick. Um, So if we were trying to figure out, say we knew that, okay, we're going to do a front curve of a +8, right? And then we ultimately want to get to an RX, because I think the RX in this eye is oh yeah, it's a -650, right? So say we're like, all right, cool, the front of it is a +8. We know that we want the end result of the prescription to be a -650. What we can do is we can kind of use that nominal lens formula backwards, right? The nominal lens formula is just like that one. It's like f1 plus f2, sorry, equals the power. Okay, so just to remind you kind of what that formula is, basically we can backtrack and we can be like, all right, cool, what do we need this back curve to be? Like, say you couldn't measure that back curve and you were like at the lab making these lenses and you knew you needed an 8 at the front and the ultimate script should be the 650. Think about it like this. You have to get, so if you have like a number line, you've got to get first to Plano. So say we'll put our +8 over here. Okay. So you're starting at +8. You've got to go all the way through all of these. I'm probably not going to make enough lines, but imagine that you've got to go to get from here to here. You've got to do -8 to get back to Plano, right? Because now you're at 0. And then you got to get all the way over here to minus 650 or 6.5. So you're going to make your lines here. So it's basically to get from here to here, you've done another 650 minus on your number line. So now in here, oops, keep adding a text box when I don't want to. Hold on one sec. think I have to delete this. So now your back curve is actually going to end up being -8 minus 650 to be minus 1450, right? So you can kind of fill in this formula by kind of backtracking. You're kind of finding like what the back power of the lens would have to be to get ultimately to your end power. Okay, so when you have a high base curve at the front, you've got to kind of have a crazy curve, like a crazy minus curve, like at the back of the lens to compensate for all of that plus that's at the front so that you can do a high wrapped frame. And when you do that, it makes it so if we imagine this is our +8 on the front, it makes it so your lenses actually have to be really, really thick to accommodate this kind of wild curve that occurs at the back of the lens, right? Whereas if you did this one, we would be starting not with a +8, maybe we're starting with a +4 base curve, right? So if you were to do that math out, imagining that this first number was not an 8, but instead a 4, you would have your kind of, if we look back at the number line, now if you're starting with a 4, you're starting, you're giving yourself a little bit of a head start, and you only have to do a -4 to get to Plano. And then, yeah, you still have to do that minus 650 to get to the right power. But 4 -4 and minus 650 is a minus 1050 curve on this one, which is going to be a lot less. If we kind of try to draw that out, it's going to be a lot less edge thickness than would need to be for the +8 front curve lens. Right. So hopefully that helps a little bit with, because we kind of didn't do an example like this in when we worked with the nominal lens formula. We kind of focused on, okay, the front surface plus the back surface is going to be this power, right? Which is nice and simple, but they may ask you questions, on the test of like, okay, if the front surface is this, and then the back, I'm sorry, and the end power is this, what kind of back curve might you need, right? So that's kind of, just, the backwards way of, kind of filling in the missing number. And you have to think when you're starting with a high plus on the front, you really have to think about, okay, how much would it take to actually get to 0, and then, oh, I need to get to my power. If you're doing something with a plus power, that makes it easier. Like, say the script, the end result was supposed to be, a plus 650 rather than a minus 650. All right, you really don't have to go, you'd start at a +8 and maybe, end up here. So you really don't have to do much of anything. But, that's an example I wanted to go over. I do plan to do a couple classes just towards the end. We're getting close to the end of the material, but I do plan to do a couple classes where we just go over questions, practice questions from the exam. So we'll return to this again, but it's a good example to know about. So, all right, going to move on a little bit. So I'm going to move from on to the PDF that was called Types of Lenses. And this is actually in the scans of the books that I give you too. I don't think I actually asked you to read this, but it is in book 4, 5 as well. But I thought that the PDFs were like, they just look nicer. So the thing that I wanted to touch on first is aspheric lenses. Good concept. Good thing to know. Let me just put in a picture here of what aspheric looks like. I did ask you guys to watch a video that hopefully illustrated this concept fairly well, so I won't go into it too much. But basically, this picture shows, the typical thickness and shape of a spherical lens, as well as what an aspheric lens looks like. I mean, aspheric, basically, you want to kind of think not a sphere. Um, I would say it's a more oval shaped of a lens. It can definitely correct for astigmatism as well. So if you hear atoric, it means that it's an aspheric lens that has toric capabilities or toric properties, meaning it corrects for astigmatism. You may know toric contacts, so that will help you there. Um, it is the reason that you would use an aspheric lens is because there is much less lens thickness because of the flatter curves that can be achieved, right? So you can see this is flatter than the other lens, the traditional spherical lens, and it also reduces magnification. So if you think about someone who really dislikes the look of their eyes behind their glasses. Usually, obviously, this is going to be a plus powered person or a person with plus power. The aspheric lenses will help reduce that magnification. So that's a really nice benefit. However, one of the cons of them is that they can induce a bit more peripheral distortion. So if someone's kind of looking off axis, not going to be quite as good in an aspheric lens. Okay. So, wanted to touch on that briefly. Definitely a good thing to know. Not something, sadly, it's not really something that we do a lot of in our offices. We used to do a lens that was called, we had an optician that w- she really swore by this lens. It was called a double aspheric. It was a Seiko lens and it was a double aspheric. We used to you do a lot more like kind of crazy stuff in the office. Now it's just I don't know, it's just too complicated to get all the I don't know, get with the right labs and kind of control the results and it just to keep track of everything. And but anyway, we used to do a lens called the double aspheric, and she this optician was a high plus power. I think she was like a plus 650, and she really I agree with her. Really made the lenses look like her eyes looked much less magnified behind the aspheric lenses than they did behind spherical lenses. So it definitely had a strong effect. But I would tell you that we don't typically order these. If we did, it would be something that we'd probably do again more on the private pay side of things than with vision plans because it's just unfortunately it's just hard to get customized unusual products with the vision plans. So but to move on from that, I did want to talk to you about spherical equivalent. So if you are a technician, I am sure that you are very familiar with spherical equivalent, but it's really fun. It's pretty easy. But basically what it says, I'm just gonna type this out quickly so that we have it here. But it says that sphere power plus half the cell power um, is spherical equivalent. Oops. So basically, sphere power plus half of the cell power um, would be the spherical equivalent. So let's imagine what that would be like. So let's illustrate that concept. So if you start out with a +2, -1 prescription at axis 90, right here, I've written that out. Remember when you're writing prescriptions, this is something that might be a question on the test. You always want to have 3 numbers in the axis, even if it's something that only takes 1 number or 2 numbers, 1 digit or 2 digits, I should say. You want to put in those zeros. Okay, so say something's at axis 2, um, you want to put in those 2 zeros, basically. Okay, so you'll notice that when I wrote the 90, you always, even though I don't need that 0 in front, it's something that you do want to have. So anyway, with spherical equivalent, if you look at the cell power, remember we're going to cut this cell power in half. So what that would be is a minus 0.5. Pretty straightforward, right? That would be wants to go in a strange place, but it would be minus 0.5 instead of -1. And then you're going to combine that half cell power with the sphere power. So that would mean that basically the script would be, if we had the spherical equivalent of it, plus I'm sorry, yes. It would be plus 150, and we'll write sphere. Okay, so basically what I've done is just gone I've taken the sill, I've cut it in half, and then I have combined the sill power and the sphere power. I no longer need the axis because it's a spherical lens, but basically now it would be plus 150 sphere. So pretty straightforward. We'll do maybe one more just to kind of show you. I know that you guys are, definitely, on the tech side of things. This comes into play when you may want to reduce the amount of astigmatism that's in a prescription, right? So, say a common example in our office might be that someone comes in and um, maybe they had been prescribed, let's say, a minus 250, and let's say they had a lot of sale. Let's just say it's at 180. So let's say that someone had come in, they had refracted to a minus 250, minus 3 sill at axis 180. And then they give us a call and they say, depending on how sensitive they are or how upset they are. They either tell us that they can't see anything out of the glasses, they just can't wear these, or they tell us, if they're a little more calm, oh, I have this fishbowl effect. Oh, things look like they're slanted. I have, a very swimmy feeling. Um, those are all kind of it might be the sill or could very likely be the sill complaints, right? So let's say they go back into the exam room, the technician refracts them, probably going to refract to exactly the same numbers or very, very close. And so, what do? We're not going to give them the same script. Obviously, they're having trouble adjusting. We might do some spherical equivalent. So, now if we took out all of that cell, that's a ton of, I mean, it's a good amount of cell, right? Like, we don't want to just completely spherical equivalent this out of there. Now, let's just do the example if we did want to. So, we would cut it in half. Um, so that if we were gonna just be like, okay, no sell, um, you would cut it in half, and then that would become a minus 150, and then you would combine the minus 150 and the minus 250. So I suppose, um, what would that be? That would be a minus 4, I think. Um, yeah, it would go up to 3 and then 4. Okay. So basically it would be a minus 4 sphere if you completely eliminated the sill. Now that's going to be pretty blurry for them, so that's not something that we would typically do just because they have a good amount of sill. But one thing that we might do is we might say, okay, let me just erase this so it's not confusing. Um, we might say, all right, let's take out some of this cell, right? So, like, let's make it a little bit less cell, so hopefully they'll have a little bit better chance to adapt to it. It won't throw them as much. So maybe what we might do is take out some of it. So let's say we're going to cut this by a diopter, right? So if we're going to cut this down by a diopter, that means that half of a diopter, should keep my symbols here though, would be zero point 0.5, right? So then what we would do is combine this zero point 0.5 with the 250. Now, the only confusing thing about this, which I hope is not screwing things up by saying this, is just that now the script, you're going to combine this minus 50 and the minus 250. So you're going to be at a minus 3, but you still have to keep that sill power because you left some of it there, right? This is an RX check, not full spherical equivalent. So what you've done is you've taken away a diopter of sill, right? We've kind of made this into a minus 2, right? And we had to do something with that diopter. You can't just take that out and pretend it didn't exist. You have to then put that back into the sphere power. Okay, so that's where we ended up with this -3, but we had the sill still, we had some of that sill, we didn't completely spherical equivalent it out. So that's where we get the 2, and then we have to keep the 180 in there. So, that's something that the technicians are doing really frequently, obviously, that the doctors are doing. But hopefully, in this case, it would make it a little bit easier for that person to adapt to the sill. Um, I was talking about this the other day with some of the opticians last Thursday, but some of the things I think that we need to do is we need to kind of talk to patients about changes in prescription. As much as we'd like them to be fully seamless and perfect, and take no adaptation, oftentimes they're not like that. Some people could wear, their neighbor's glasses, and it doesn't really matter to them. Like, they're just like, yeah, whatever, I can kind of see. But some people, you change the axis 3 degrees and they're like going bananas. So it's kind of an art of explaining to people, we're trying to get your vision as crisp as possible, make things as clean and good looking as we possibly can, get as much clarity for you. And that's why we're, prescribing this amount of astigmatism, because you're not going to get to that if we don't prescribe the astigmatism. But your glasses may take a little bit longer to adapt to. Your brain will get used to this. You will get there, but it's going to take a little bit more work, and it might be a little bit more uncomfortable for a few days when you switch, to the new prescription. But obviously, some people don't want to hear that. That's not something that they're about to do. They're not going to, like, take some time to get used to it. They're not going to kind of work at it. So in those cases, we might do something more like kind of heavier on the spherical equivalent. So again, that's another concept that we can go over. The first example, just to be super clear, took out the entire cell power, whereas the second example only took out a diopter of the cell power. Um, okay, you do want to get very, I was looking at my notes. You do want to get very comfortable doing this. So, that's it. Spherical equivalent, you definitely, want to practice. So we can do some practice questions of it later on. All right, so a couple more things. I wanted to show you some um, cataract lenses, cataract glasses, which we don't see much. One term that's important more on the anatomy side is aphakic, which means that someone does not have a lens in their eye. So basically, cataract surgery is needed when the lens in the eye gets very clouded, right? It kind of gets, it's a little gross, but it gets like gooky kind of cloudy stuff in it. And basically that when they do cataract surgery, they remove the lens and thus that cloudy stuff. So that then, you're not looking through a cloud anymore, right? Now before nowadays they put in an IOL or an interocular lens into the eye. So it's almost like, you have glasses inside your eye, or you have a new perfect lens inside your eye, right? So your vision is corrected, and a lot of people really don't need as much correction, after cataract surgery, or they wear glasses less after cataract surgery. But before that, they used to have cataract glasses. And so aphakic glasses, or an aphakic is the term for the person who doesn't have the lens, but basically it would be an extremely high powered lens. And you can see that from this picture, where it's actually a lenticular lens, which means that it's in a carrier. It has a lens that kind of goes around the outside of the lens that has the power. The lens that has the power is this inside part. And it's so strong that if we were to just make a lens in this power, it would be extremely thick, extremely heavy. So they kind of put that lenticular lens in the middle of a carrier, and that way the carrier is not as thick, and can just function better for the patient. I'll show you a couple more pictures. Um, Definitely, you may have seen some like this, but always kind of cool to look at funky lenses. Just gonna snip this one too. So the aphakic one is high plus because the lens in your eye is plus powered. These are high minus. So you can see that the lens itself is here, and then you can see the carrier in the periphery. Um, and then I have one more for you. This is probably the craziest one. But these are myodisc lenses. So again, very high myope. Just get it in here. So kind of crazy looking. Kind of sucks to wear these, I'm sure. But she has super high RX. You can tell by how much it's minifying like the look of her eye. And then there's a carrier around the outside. The carrier appears to be quite thick as well, but those are, used for people that are super, super high minus. So um, lenticular lenses are those. All right, let me see what we're gonna go into here. A ton of things. Not gonna get through it all tonight. Okay, so one thing I want to talk about is they briefly touched on free form lenses versus conventional lenses. This happens to be a topic that I like a lot. I'm really into progressives. Definitely, you know, you can tell by all the progressive shapes we have, like I like that stuff. But basically, the picture that I want to put up here is um, this picture because I feel like it helps visualize it. But I want you to know, and they did talk about this a little bit, is that there are two types of um, lenses, right? And it kind of mostly applies to progressives, but can apply to single vision a little bit too. But basically, there are lenses that they can both. I'm sorry, not. I wrote that there are two kinds of digital lenses, but in general, what there really are is there are molded conventional lenses for progressives and single vision, and then there are also digitally surfaced lenses. And so the reason I have this picture here is because it's showing a stylus that is used. This is like when they make lenses, they basically have a gigantic like hockey puck piece of plastic that is put onto, I don't know what the correct term for this is, but basically this is the thing that will go and kind of hold the lens while it's being ground, whether it's being buffed or ground with a stylus. But basically what's happening here is there's a stylus that's grinding out, it's digitally grinding out the lens. And the reason that this is important is because this is a digital freeform lens. And this is how digital lenses, whether it's a single vision digital or a fully freeform digital progressive, that's how these are made. And the benefit of them is that they can just get to way more precise detail and prescriptions. They can grind something to like the thousandth of a diopter, rather than the old style, which is to have a lens that comes pre-molded, right? So a lot of progressives come with a pre-molded lens blank, right? And then there's a lot of the powers in these, especially the add powers, are pre-done into this lens blank. And then, yes, there is a digital component. They will take the digital stylus and grind some of your power into the back of that lens, but it's not fully free-form digital throughout the lens. Like your add power is already in there in a mold. Your corridor is already in that mold. It's not as customized as fully freeform. So, a lot of people kind of rag on Varilux lenses. So, your Physio lenses, your Varilux X design, your, what are they? The W3. Um, what else? The Definity. Like a lot of those Varilux lenses are molded designs. And honestly, like a lot of people really like those, and it's probably being a little too picky to freak out about it too much. But the concept is that a digital lens, Shamir does this, Seiko does this, IoT does this. Those manufacturers do it fully freeform. They do the entire grinding from computer calculations, and it's much more customized than a lens blank that comes partially molded. So Um, important stuff to kind of know about. I did have you watch that compensated RX video. It was really quick. It was John Seeger again, and he talked about like, wait, when I get a prescription, that I've ordered, maybe it's a minus 650 minus one. Why does it come back as a minus 6.38 minus 0.95 rather than that minus 650 minus 1, and that's because it is a fully freeform digital lens. It's been compensated for the prescription, for the ad power, for the corridor, and also for the vertex and the fit of the glasses, the frame that the patient is wearing. So it's as customized as you can possibly get. So if you hear the term compensated, that means that it's taken in the frame, the script, the measurements into account to grind the perfect RX into that lens for that patient. So we will again, we'll talk more about this. In a future class, but I did want to see if we can get through some of the different bifocal designs quickly before we have to wrap up. Bifocals. So this is one of the more antiquated parts of the exam. I honestly feel like, I mean, it's nice to know optical history. It's good things, but this is not something that you would be using much, but it is definitely on the ABO test. So um, it would be fun to see a Franklin bifocal, but sadly we probably won't. But anyway, the things that you need to know about bifocals, right? Um, generally, this one here is the one you should know. This is the one that we're going to be using, and that's the one that you're going to see like people actually wearing, and other optical shops are going to do this, right? So it's called a flat top, it's called a straight top. Apparently, it's also called a D-seg. Personally, I've never heard it called that, but I'm sure many people have. And you can tell that the diameter of the seg is going to typically be in our office. We usually do straight top 28s or flat top 28s. So this is going to be 28 millimeters across. It's going to have a rounded bottom. You can do straight top 35s, little less availability. So we don't typically do those as much. You run into a lot of trouble with getting transitions, getting high index, we used to have a lab that wouldn't coat them with certain ARs. So, availability problems are the name of the game with bifocals. So it's one reason that we don't typically do a lot of them. But important to know, because I know you'll be asked this, where the optical center of the segment is. Right, so in a straight top 28 or your typical bifocal, it's going to be 4 millimeters below the top of the segment. Okay, so that means that we'll talk about optical centers. I think it's next class. But those are typically in the middle of the lens for the distance portion. But in a bifocal, it's going to be in the segment. Franklin bifocals, also called executive bifocals. Those are kind of cool. They go the entirety of your lens. It would be like if you saw someone wearing this, they'd have a line that went fully across. Um, Kind of neat because you could like read from any angle, like you don't have to worry about being in that little area of seg. um but very uncommon. I've never seen one in real life. But apparently they're also quite thick and heavy. All right, cryptox. Those ones are something that you could actually get. Now, whether you'd call it a cryptoc, I don't know. You might just call it like a round seg. But basically, they have a round segment in the lens. Tends to be a little bit smaller. Um, Apparently, they're typically 22 to 28 millimeters, and they can also be. Sometimes you'll see a round seg that's like a line, like around the seg, like a delineated difference between the distance power and the seg. Other times you'll see them be blended, almost as though someone took a little eraser and like smudged out the line between the round seg and the back of the lens. Um, it looks nicer. It kind of was like, oh, it's almost like I'm wearing a progressive, right? Because you can't see the line. The only thing is, it creates blur in that smudgy area between the round seg and the actual lens, and so that's really not ideal optically. So, people, you may see these, but again, fairly unusual. Couple other ones that I wanted to go over. There's some cool, strange designs that will um, that we'll see here. Go down one more. Oops. Okay. So, a couple more bifocals. So the Ultex. This is one that again I don't know this one. Like I've never seen it. If you had been an optical, for I don't know, 20, 30 years, you probably would. But basically, it's a very large seg that is not straight, it's rounded. And the OC in this is low. So the thing that a low OC causes is a lot of image jump. So I know you guys are most likely familiar with image jump, but it basically means that the powers are so different between the distance power and the near power and where the optical centers are, that it creates like you'll be looking at something and then you'll look at your near and it'll be like, whoa, like it's almost like your keyboard moved, or whatever you were looking at is now in a completely different spot than where it was in the distance portion. So it's basically like the image jumps, which is not great. Blended seg, we talked a little bit about how a cryptoc can kind of become a blended seg, but it basically you know, kind of creates an area of blur. It says 2 to 3 millimeters of unusable space where that blur is or where that transition is. It's not like a progressive where you basically use the transition. You have to like avoid the transition. So, not super common. Sometimes you'll see something called, they didn't put this in the book, but a digital round seg, which would be a little bit more like this. And since it's digitally done, there's not like an area of blended crummy vision. So I have heard of opticians using digital round segs for people who just really like a round seg bifocal. Okay. Last little bit about bifocals. There are kind of the really crazy ones. And we'll do trifocal too. So this one, the double D bifocal, is likely to be on the exam, probably because it's just kind of weird. Um, Okay, so double D. So it basically means that with the double D, if I cut off the part that talks about it, sadly I might have. But the double D is an occupational bifocal. Okay, so it's kind of cool. It's like if you are a plumber, an electrician, someone who is constantly like looking up, like doing work above your head that's in a close proximity. What it is you can, if you're kind of normally like reading a newspaper or just doing normal everyday tasks, you can use this bottom seg. But if you're an electrician and you're looking up and you're doing wiring above your head, you can use the seg that's at the top of your lens too. So pretty cool. I know I was asking Chris about it. He said that he had done a couple of them for patients, like, years back. Definitely not super common, but it is something that's available. So if you ever had someone that was like, hey, like, I'm doing this trade or I'm doing this thing where I need to, be able to see up close over my head, that's kind of a cool option. And then there's the double executive. I don't know. I don't know that you would really be um seeing this, but it's kind of the same idea, but just with the two like executive, like fully across the lens, and then you have this really tiny area of the distance in the middle, basically. There's also a ribbon seg, which I don't think there's a picture of, but is in the books, one of these readings it's in. And it's almost the opposite of this. It's actually just like distance on the top and the bottom, and then the middle of it is like the seg, is the add power. So that's kind of an interesting one as well. Can't I apologize. I can't think what you would want that for. but apparently one might. All right, so last, you have trifocals. Trifocals, again, not something we do super commonly in our offices, again, largely just because the availability is somewhat small. Some doctors, I would say, prescribe these a lot because it's kind of like a progressive, right? It's the bifocal that has the intermediate power, which is nice, right? Um, so depending on how wide you want it, they come in 7 by 28s and 8 by 35. Um, 7 by 28 means that it's 28 across the top of it, and 7 millimeters is what the intermediate height is. You could kind of deduce from that that an 8 by 35 means that it's 35 across the top and 8 millimeters high of intermediate power. The drawback of trifocals is that you can't customize like what the intermediate power is. So the person just kind of has to be happy with what comes, right? So basically, you do your add power, and then the intermediate power is going to be whatever half of that add power is, right? So it kind of is what it is. It does not transition. It does not change. So that particular focal distance of that intermediate power better be where your computer is, because that's not going to be something that you can kind of lift your head like a progressive and kind of find the right intermediate power. All right. And apparently there is also an executive trifocal, which I'm sure you can now recognize an executive, Franklin style. It goes all the way across. Um, they do mention image jump, so I think that's probably a good thing to know about your traditional trifocal, is that it must be that the OC is low in this seg, and that can cause the, kind of a disorienting jump between them. And they are pointing out again that executive lenses are heavy. So that's another important thing to remember. Probably a question about that. All right. I think that probably going to stop there. The next thing that we're going to talk about, which we'll talk about next week, or not in 2 weeks, is converting a multifocal RX to a near vision RX, something that our techs are very familiar with, but that we need to go over. And we would also want to figure out, how do you make an intermediate prescription, something for the computer, from a multifocal RX. Definitely super important concepts. We're also going to talk about safety lenses. Um, and then in the next class, we are going to be talking about adjustments a good bit. So basically, adjusting frames. So one thing that I would ask you, it might be helpful to have a frame, and if you're having trouble locating one that would work, send me a message, because I can kind of point you in the right direction. But you kind of want a frame that you feel comfortable practicing on, for this part, for the next class, because typically in these classes I'm really just kind of trying to get through the material, so I'm not really doing a lot of like asking for feedback, that sort of thing. But we're going to talk about different adjustments. So if you have in particular a metal frame, and again, if you need to grab like an older one or something, let me know. Like if you're having trouble finding one, we do have like donations in the offices that kind of come in. So that would be a good place to look. But I can figure out one for you if you're having trouble. But for the next class, it would be great to have a metal frame that you could just kind of adjust and kind of put out of whack, basically, because that's something that we're going to be talking about in the next class. All right, guys. So thank you for your time tonight, and I will post this video and the readings for the next time shortly. And just remember to have a frame available if possible to work on a little bit of adjustments for the next class. And
All
have a good
right.
night, guys.
Sounds
Thank
good. Have
you.
a good
Good
night.
night.
Thanks.
Good
See you
night.
guys soon.